Got it.
And decided to start advancing around the house in the other direction. First few rooms looked like they were just tiny guest rooms for Mr. Sandal's visitors. But after rounding a corner and finding another room with a frag mine in front of it, we decided that maybe we had found the right place.
No problem.
And once we opened the door, we found Shen Vitale standing in what looked like a prison cell. However, the let's call him sentimental young man insisted that he would not leave the house without Rahasia due to fear of fallout from her father.
What are you doing?
She wasn't thrilled with the idea, but considering she had such strong feelings for him, she decided to go for it. She decided to take off and find her own way out of the house, which seemed like a good idea. Seeing all of us come out together might raise a few red flags. In case there were, you know, in case Mr. Sandal happened to be staring at the camera for the outside. But as soon as we left the house...
But surely we can...
As soon as we left the house, lo and behold, Mr. Vitale wandered up with some of his war droids just as Mr. Sandal left the house. And boy, oh boy, was it quite the standoff. We managed to, however...
But I... I will...
Then you prefer.
Thank you again.
Managed to find a way through the whole minefield of the discussion. Thankfully, we managed to make both fathers see reason after they saw the love that their children had for each other. And eventually, funny enough, the kids actually almost strong-armed their fathers into building a house for the two of them, if you can believe it. Man, their kids were going to be little hellraisers, that was for sure. But we had solved the problem. And so with that, it was time to head back to the Jedi Enclave so that we could head over to the ruins and investigate what Revan and Malak had found. On our way back, though, we headed through the grove once again. I sensed something still active within the grove. Which was strange because we'd already cleared it of a bunch of Mandalorians and Juhani. But I still sensed some presence. Found a few Kath hounds, but they had been there the whole time and kept constantly reappearing. But then I saw what the real problem was. Lo and behold, where we had fought one of the largest group of Mandalorians, there now stood a Mandalorian in red armor.
Sure.
And as I well knew, red was the color of the Mandalorian sergeants. That meant someone with some actual authority and skill, even more than the rest that I had found, was active. And as we walked up, he challenged us. I knew, though, as much as he was a threat, we had to take out his support. He was wielding two heavy swords at the time, though, and descended upon us quickly. Thankfully, Bastila kept him locked down with the Force, while I moved on to carving up the other support warriors he had brought with them. After just a few short seconds, it was me, Bastila, and Karth versus him, and just before he struck down Bastila, I swooped in and saved her. Found a number of lightsabers that apparently Sheruk was his name, had taken from Jedi. I knew that if he had them, it meant we probably weren't going to be able to return them to their rightful owners. But if nothing else, I could carry them in memory of the Jedi who had fallen to his monstrosity. Thankfully, Bastila managed to survive her near-death experience and actually gained insight at the time. But now I sensed the true threat was clear, and that the Mandalorians would no longer be as big of a problem for the people of Dantooine without their leader.
You cannot win.
As is to be expected at this point, we continued to run into Kath hounds, but there was nothing major stopping us from getting back to the Jedi. We had to find out just what Revan and Malak had found during their adventures through the ruins. Found a strange Kathhound who constantly ran away from us until he stopped suddenly, and I just stood there as I cut him up. But I won't complain. I was getting pretty tired of fighting Kathhounds all the time. But with that, we found ourselves back at the ruins once again. Could feel strong emanations of the dark side coming from it. It was impressive that the Jedi had managed to stop new apprentices from finding this place or from exploring it, but we had no choice. We had to go in. We had to find out what Revan and Malak had learned while they were here. Found a droid who spoke a number of strange languages. It ended up speaking Selkath to us. It said something about builders and the Empire. Apparently, he talked about something called the Star Forge. But it eventually said that the only way to progress forward was to prove ourselves worthy, whatever the heck that meant. But we opened a door and bam, we were confronted with what apparently was going to judge us worthy. A combat droid with a large shield. But this was no ordinary droid. This was way stronger than anything we had faced before.
So be it.
Spewing fire in every direction, we threw everything we had at this droid and shrugged it off, mostly. But slowly but surely, we managed to carve into it. It practically seemed especially resistant to lightsabers. But with the three of us throwing everything we had into it, we eventually took the thing down. Found an old disabled version of one of the droids, but we found a computer. I pressed as many buttons as I could, but then after I tried talking to the computer, strangely enough, it opened a receptacle. I put my data pad in, talked to the thing, and apparently it decided I was allowed to use the computer now. It translated itself, and it said, identify life-giving world types. And out of the 6 options, it was easy enough to tell which 3 that it was talking about. And it said something about a lock being opened. But since there was a second door on the other side of the droid, I figured I must have to go through another challenge. Open the door, and lo and behold, another droid was waiting for us. Decided to start off with a different tactic. We had found many, many grenades in our time. And I decided it couldn't hurt for Bastila, Karth, and I to all throw some grenades. When I say we, I mean me and Karth, because I decided that Bastila might be better used trying to use her disabled droid, her new disabled droid powers on the droid.
What can I do?
And just like that, we had started off. The grenades actually seemed to do fairly well against the droid. Its shield fell very quickly. But then just like that, I was back in close with my lightsaber and sword. Damn thing froze me for a second, and all I could do was stare out of a layer of carbonite that it encased me with multiple times, and stare into its one blinking eye next to its blaster. But I wrenched myself free and did the same thing with the computer that I had done with the other one. Talked about death-giving seal, whatever the heck that meant. But after entering the information, I heard a loud rumbling, and apparently the door to the back area was unlocked. And just like that, we came across it. A strange device sat in front of us, and as we got closer, it opened itself. After a few seconds, a small sphere started to float in the middle of the device, and suddenly a map.
This must be one.
We decided to call it a star map, based on what the droid had told us. But the data seemed incomplete, but 4 points on the map were glowing brightly. Manon, Korriban, Kashyyyk, and Tatooine all glowed with the same glow that the planet we could tell was Dantooine glowed with. Therefore, after talking it over with Bastila, we realized that the most likely course was to head to these other planets and find more of these star maps. And with that, we knew that we had to return to the Jedi Council and tell them of this momentous news. Of course, as soon as we headed back to the Enclave, we stumbled across yet more Kath Hounds. Luckily, by this point, I was more than capable of dealing with them. Thankfully, we turned the final corner and the Enclave, safe and sound, was in sight. Talked to Adam Larp, but something seemed to be wrong with his lightsaber crystals.
My droid is...
I tried talking to the woman, Elise.
Please.
And she told us that she had missed her droid. I decided to take a quick journey and look for the droid. Hopefully it wouldn't be too hard to find. I wasn't sure why Elise had been so reluctant to actually ask me to find the droid. Instead, she had just strangely cut herself off and not really seemed interested in it, but finally I got her to admit that her droid was missing. Took off at high speed. I decided to use my new Jedi robes to stretch my force power legs. Literally, as I was employing my new power that accelerated my running. Just like that, Karth, Basil, and I were flying across Dantooine. I figured the best course of action was to head for that Force Crystal Cave. If the Kinrath had gotten a hold of the droid, they might have dragged it into the cave with them. And I figured even the droid would be smart enough to avoid the Mandalorian-infested areas around the grove. As we walked past the battleground where we had fought Sherik, I was reminded of that tense battle. But as we approached the cave, we found the droid being smashed to pieces by a pair of Kath Hounds. I quickly dispatched them, and the other horn Kath Hound that had been hanging around the area, watching them do this to this droid. But with them dispatched, we talked to C-842. Apparently, Elise had gotten a little too attached to him. We convinced C-842 that Elise, while maybe a bit too attached to him, really did need his support. When we returned to the Enclave, we talked to Bastila about this vision that we had had. I asked her about why our fates seemed to suddenly be linked, but all she could say was, But, having completed our conversation with Bastila about why we were suddenly bonded and sharing Force visions, a topic we really hadn't had the chance to discuss over my weeks of training, I decided to run back outside and tell Elise what had happened and how we had found her droid, if the droid hadn't already made it back to her. After that, well, I knew it was going to be time to leave Dantooine. Bastila was still making a face, so I decided to talk to her again. She asked me a bunch of strange questions about my past and wanted to know how I answered her questions. I don't know, it felt like she was giving me some kind of test. But apparently I passed and was honest with her.
Thank you. Please, again.
I tried to tell John I didn't need a reward from him for taking care of the Mandalorians, but he insisted I take the money. But then we quickly found Elise in C842, and Elise wouldn't even let me get a word in edgewise before she was running back into the Enclave with her droid a little close in tow. Funny enough, we managed to follow her back inside because we were also heading into the into the Enclave. We finally needed to report to the Council what we'd found of Revan and Malak. Decided to take the time to investigate the Jedi apartments, though. Rahasia and Shen had actually indicated that they might have been coming here. And lo and behold, I found Elise inside already. But no Shen and Rahasia.
Oh, thank.
But as soon as I tried to talk to Elise and tell her that maybe she should back off, she just insisted on taking off again. So I figured, unfortunately, there was just nothing I could do to stop her from getting continually too attached to C842. But there was nothing more I could do for the droid at the time, so I finally reported to the Jedi Council what me and Bastila had found.
Ah, you have returned, young Padawan. Have you discovered...
Upon hearing about this news of the star map, the Jedi Council told me that they would investigate.
And we will summon you.
But even Master Dorak, chronicler of the Academy, couldn't find any information.
Discovering the star.
The Council told me that as much as they were reluctant to send me out on this fresh mission, they knew that they really didn't have a choice in the matter. And so, with that, we were on our way. At this point, I finally decided to start wielding a second lightsaber. One of the ones I had taken from Sherrick. The Jedi Council, though, informed me that I would be heading off on this mission as I expected to find these other star maps, and that Bastila would accompany me along with everyone from Taris, and that they had decided to assign Juhani to the ship after her request. Before we tried to leave, a Twi'lek named Dizra asked for a quick discussion. Apparently, he wanted to tell me the story of the Terran attack, one of the most incredibly strong and dangerous creations of the Sith. A horrible creature that had been created with Sith alchemy to hunt Jedi. Apparently, there was a great hunt in the Jedi at some point in the past, not so distant past, that had been used to hunt them down, but no one knew how successful it was. But just like that, we were back on the Hawk, finally with a chance to get off this planet.
Okay.
Finally used the chance to talk to Mission, as I hadn't talked to her in weeks, and she told me about her brother Griff and his girl Lena.
Yeah, what do you...
Now she had stolen him from her. I talked to Canderous for the first time in a while, and he told me about his first ever attack as a Mandalorian when he dropped from a ship in a Basilisk wardrobe and destroyed the generators powering the shields of a planet. He sounded a little too excited by it, if I do say so myself. But after taking a nice second to explore the ship, we finally had a sense of the Ebon Hawk. We had had such a hectic time from Taris, and I'd spent so much time in the Academy, I hadn't gotten to enjoy it. Juhani insisted on asking for my forgiveness as soon as we met up. I told her it wasn't a problem, but she was hearing none of it.
How can I help?
Decided to use this chance to kind of, you know, not flirt with Bastila, but We had a good conversation. Karth decided to vent to me. But, you know, that quickly turned into him shouting about how I was just another Saul Kareth, which I thought was a little unfair. But just like that, it was time to leave Dantooine, and we left. I decided to make for Yavin before continuing on to a star map world. While on Dantooine, I'd heard a rumor that there was an amazing shop in orbit above Yavin. And while I knew that the planet was mostly taboo and a no-fly zone after the events of Exar Kun,
at 200% capacity, far beyond our expectations.
I am more interested in the young Jedi Bastila and her battle meditation. Have you learned how she escaped the destruction of Taris?
She was aided by Karth Onasi, a decorated war hero of the Republic and a legendary soldier. During the Mandalore Wars, he was honored many times for his bravery.
You know this man?
Yes, Lord Malak, he served under me when I still followed the Republic. You could say I was his mentor.
Interesting. How did you acquire this information, Admiral?
An eyewitness, Lord Malak. Calo Nord, a bounty hunter, was there when Bastila and Karth escaped the planet. Apparently, they left him for dead.
A Jedi and a war hero. It's a wonder you survived the encounter.
I am hard to kill, Lord Malak.
Calo has agreed to help us capture the young Bastila for a very hefty fee, of course. But I assure you he is well worth the price. His reputation as a bounty hunter is well earned.
Her companions are nothing to me, Calo. But I desire the young Jedi taken alive, if at all possible.
Lord Malak, forgive me, there is something else. May we have a private audience away from the ears of the common soldiers?
I trust you are not wasting my time, Admiral Kareth.
I promise you will be very interested in what Calo has to tell you about Bastila's other companions, Lord Malak.
ugh, what an awful nightmare that was. Anyway, as I was trying to say, I had heard a rumor about a station in orbit above Yavin 4. But after we finished the jump through hyperspace, Zalbar told me that apparently someone had been rooting around in our food supplies and asked me to investigate, so I took off for the cargo hold. As far as I could tell, someone had been into our food, but I had no idea who it would be. Everyone else ate together. Decided to investigate, see if I could find any evidence of someone moving around in the ship. I had no idea. I didn't sense anyone in the Force. I'm sure Bastila would have said something to me if she had. I went to the engine room, but as soon as I did, I thought I heard footsteps. Tried to go see Canderous, see if Harry heard anything before I even made it. I heard more footsteps. But as I explored, I returned to the cargo hold and found a young woman. She was speaking in some really strange, broken Mandalorian. Told her my name was Mr. Pazaak, because, you know, I am. But she apparently was a slave of the Mandalorians. It took me a long time, but I actually learned her language. Although she had just arrived on the ship, apparently while we were on Dantooine, she apparently decided that the ship was safe and her home already. Apparently she had been a Mandalorian slave or something on Dantooine. But she seemed to be confused when I told her that she had somewhere else that she was supposed to live, but all I could do was keep her on the ship and keep her fed until we got to Dantooine. But I knew I wanted to at least talk to the shop on this Yavin Station. This place wasn't huge, so I decided to go alone. Found a few airlocks where there were apparently other ships that could dock, but quickly we found the man in charge. But after a short conversation with the Rhodian, who apparently was the only man on the station, if you can believe it, he offered to let us inside and talk to him. He had a few Giza hopping around and some panels, but he had a beautiful view of Yavin and Yavin 4. But I decided to talk shop with him. He was apparently so well known for his high quality stuff. He actually spent some time talking about XR Kun, and apparently telling me about some issues he had with some, you know, some pretty awful, what are they called? Trandosians. He sold some amazing stuff, but unfortunately I basically couldn't afford any of it. Some of his stuff was quite impressive, though. I was really sad I couldn't use it. But he told me that he was always getting new things. He actually wanted to wager on a pretty heavy stakes on a Pazaak game, and finally I was playing my game again. Started off with a 7, led into him getting a 9, but when I ended up with a 15, I knew I had to take the chance and slam down the +5. But he answered back with his own +-, and he had a +2, and I was still on the high numbers. I decided to stand on 17 and take it easy. I figured he'd beat me, but he'd probably have to use a card to do it, which he did. One round is pretty close to worth a card in Pazaak. But then we were off, and he was off way higher than I was. He decided to sit on 18. But when I was at 18, I knew I could either take... I decided to take the tie because he had wasted a card. I was up 2 cards to 1, or 3 cards to 1. And I decided to stand on 17. Even if I lost the round, it wasn't worth it when I had such high plus values. He used up his last card to get up to 18, but I had 3 cards, even though I was down 2 rounds to 0. But I knew he would have to stand on whatever he could possibly get. Bam, just like that. Used a card, hit the 20. Was down to pure luck at this point for him. Kept hoping he'd high roll, but then I snagged the perfect 20. And then he busted. And I had 2 cards to his 0, and it was the final round. Boom, 15 plus 5, I'm at 20. He drew and drew. It was all up to the deck now if he was going to survive or not. Just like that. Bust. And I defeated Suvam. We actually ended up playing for a lot of credits. Thankfully, though, I finally got Suvam to admit that I was pretty good, and we decided to play again. I knew that just one more game and I'd have earned a solid 1,500 credits from him. Took a very risky hit on 16. When he stood on 19, I knew I had my chance, and bam, 26, played the only -6 in my hand. 1 card down a piece, and we were good. Snake Eyes off the top for me meant that I was slow rolling him. But then he pulled back and got right up to 10 just as slowly as I did. But he stood on 18, and I pulled the 20 off the top, and that was it. 2-0, and I was even up a card. I decided to stand on 19. Even if he won a round, it was worth it. And he did. Of course, the lucky bastard pulled off the nat 20. But just like that, we were back in. And I decided to stand on 18. Considering he had to use a card to match me, I felt fine. But neck and neck, he used his last card to get to 18. I said screw it, dropped my last card to drop to 17. Hit again, got a 10. Tied up, and I had 2 ±5s in my hand. He decided to stay on 17, and boom, got the 15, went to 20, and beat him. But just like that, we earned a hot 1,500. Sadly, I didn't feel like spending the money on any of the stuff Suvam had. As cool as a bunch of his stuff was, some of it was wildly expensive, and he didn't have anything for a Jedi. But I knew I'd be back. He promised he'd have better gear at some point, and I was going to hold him to it. Decided to take the opportunity to head back to Dantooine, though. I didn't want to hold on to Sasha for too long, especially considering how dangerous things were. Plus, I'd heard news of a girl being missing on Dan. But just like that, we were beset upon by Sith fighters.
Incoming fighters.
Luckily, though, I had become pretty good at using the Ebon Hawk's turret. And a few shots took out the Sith fighters that had ambushed us. And just like that, we punched it and we were off back to Dantooine. Thankfully, I'd heard that someone had been looking for a young girl like Sasha. And so we headed out. I knew that the man I was looking for was right in the starport. So as soon as I stepped out, I just stopped out alone and talked to Lur Arcasulas. Just like that, I took the man onto my ship. We managed to talk to Sasha and convince her to go home with Lur Arca. Thankfully, the man thanked me, and they were both off the ship, and I felt good. I had returned Sasha to her home, and she was no longer in danger. We weren't exactly heading for the happiest of places. Decided to head for Tatooine first. Seemed like an easy enough and innocuous enough starting point.